Hello, beautiful people. I have been asked to describe what is anti-white. Now, there are many ways to answer this question, the simplest being that anti-white is anything that can be used to demean, slander, debase, denigrate, dispossess, and destroy whites. For my part, I think the most important things used to harm whites and to perpetuate the abuses that they suffer daily is a certain habit of mind, a certain attitude that's common among whites themselves. In order to get our heads around this attitude, which I think of as being the core of what anti-white is all about, we have to consider two of its aspects. The first is the idea of racism. The second is the idea that whites themselves do not form a group. So let's deal with this thing called racism first. The important thing to understand here is that racism is almost never what we see going on. Instead, what we see going on is a program of anti-white activism. You might think to yourself that anti-whiteism is just another form of racism. But in my view, it's very important that we distinguish these things. Why? Because construing what we're dealing with as racism misses the critical point, which is that the people fomenting this don't give a damn about racism. All they care about is attacking whites and what they like to call whiteness. They don't care that white attackers are almost always immediately identified as white, while non-white attackers are typically camouflaged in reports by referring to them as youths, as strangers, as intruders, as teens. They don't care that so-called hate crimes said to be perpetrated by whites always get extensive coverage, while those perpetrated against whites are swiftly swept under the rug, if indeed there's ever any formal acknowledgement of what they actually were, which is to say crimes against individual whites on the basis of their membership in the larger group of white peoples. They don't care that legislation and grandstanding by politicians overwhelmingly focuses on the evils of whiteness and so-called white supremacy, while hatred and abuse of whites scarcely ever receives a mention. In short, pointing out their hypocrisy is useless because they don't care. As others have observed, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. So long as we keep calling it racism, they can say, so what? Everyone's racist. You've been racist in the past. You deserve it. I can't be racist. Only whites can be racist. This is why it's important for you to understand that there is no racism. It's not about racism. Racism is something very general and common to all humans. What we're dealing with here is different, something very specific, and that is anti-whiteism. Whites are the only race we're all taught to hate and revile, from primary education to secondary, and in colleges and universities, in films, in media reports, in magazines and public events. So why call it racism? It makes it seem like it's some general human characteristic bobbing to the surface again, as it always does, but it's not. It's nothing of the sort. It's a systematic and malicious anti-white program. So call it what it is, anti-white. Otherwise, they'll find rhetorical ways to squirm away from the central point that really matters. There's a reason why Jewish people, for example, never, ever refer to attacks on their group as racism, and they're wise not to. Now that we have dealt with the idea of a so-called racism, we can turn to the second issue, the idea that whites themselves do not form a group. First off, I should say that recognizing that whites do form a group doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't also be aware that further subgroupings exist, specific ethnic groups and all of that. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. Of course, subgroupings, ethnic groupings do exist, and they're extremely important. But for now, I want to focus on the larger set, the broadest category, the idea of whites themselves as a group of peoples. The biggest problem one encounters here is the fact that whites have been trained for decades not to view themselves as a group. For a white person to even think of themselves as part of a group, to say nothing of imagining that they have group interests or that they can and even should work together, is always all ready to call down blubbering accusations of white supremacy. Now, of course, there are exceptions. We're allowed to think of ourselves as a group, but only in order to paralyze ourselves with guilt. Perhaps that's why whites are the only group of peoples on Earth trained to pretend that racial and ethnic groups either don't exist or are meaningless if they do. East Asians would never imagine anything so ridiculous. The peoples of India would never indulge in such absurd ideas. Nor would Arabs, nor would the black peoples of Africa. To do so would be laughable, or worse. Imagine trying to tell Jews they don't really exist. Imagine trying to tell blacks that the very idea of being black is a pernicious fiction. Imagine trying to tell the Aboriginal peoples of Australia that any sense of group identity they have is just an illusion. Of course, almost nobody would dare to say such things, which should tell you everything you need to know. There's only one group that's supposed to gullibly swallow such nonsense. Your group, with you in it. Yes, you. Whites. Why does all of this matter? Well, perhaps the greatest danger in failing to recognize you're part of a group is that when that group is targeted as a group, you're likely to remain totally oblivious to that fact. Pattern recognition is thereby jammed. These people aren't going after whites. How could they? There's really no such thing as whites. But it gets worse. If you aren't aware that whites ever are a group, that they even could be a group, or you're in denial about it, when that group is targeted, you'll be unaware that you personally are a target, that you've been singled out, that you yourself, you individually, are, or eventually will be, in very real danger. What I'm trying to say here is that the most important anti-white thing we should all be aware of is our own stupid illusions about whether or not whites actually exist as a group. It even comes down to our own fear of what's been called taking our own side, of even recognizing that we could have a side, that some things could be good for us as a group, and that other things could be very, very bad. Meanwhile, no other group suffers from this insane dysfunction. We're trained to believe that all non-white groups should attend to and defend their own interests, and that we too should attend to the interests of all other groups, as long as the groups in question aren't white. This is the kernel and core of the anti-white program. No other racial or ethnic group, no people on Earth feels it necessary to apologize to whites for anything, ever, not one. And yet whites are expected to grovel and apologize for everything imputed to them, daily, whenever called upon to do so, at any given moment, public or of private life. And if you know what's good for you, you'd best make your self-denunciation sound convincing. Name any group that apologizes to whites. Any group. For anything. I can't think of any. Yet somehow we're expected to apologize to everyone. And for what? For existing. For breathing while white. All of this has been going on for far too long. And it's not going to stop until we understand that we're not dealing with some kind of racism, some kind of general human characteristic. It's not going to stop until we call it out for what it is, anti-whiteism. It's not going to stop until we realize that we ourselves are also to blame. We're to blame for it, insofar as we refuse to acknowledge that we, too, are a group with our own interests, our own concerns, our own territories, our own traditions, our own birthrights. And that won't happen until we realize that whites actually exist, that anti-whites exist, and that they're working overtime and patiently to destroy every last vestige of us and our cultures. That won't happen until we recognize that the collective attacks on us are individual attacks too, on each and every one of us. Perhaps when we do finally recognize all of this, then we'll stand together. Get it? Got it? Good. Semiogogue out.